fellow Kenyans and the fourth estate, the Democracy for the Citizens Party, DCP, to present the 2026-2027 alternative budget for consideration by the people of Kenya. The title of this presentation is "A Government Waging an Economic War Against its People." Fellow Kenyans, great nations and great economies are built through strategic and visionary leadership, intentional production, ethical and disciplined leadership, institutional stability, industrialization, and a collective national purpose. When these key factors lack in a nation, a country fails. Why do I say this? The government of Mr. William Ruto will present the budget estimates for the next financial year on Thursday, 11th June 2026. Later on, the Finance Bill 2026/2027 will be tabled to the National Assembly for debate. But what is in this budget and Finance Bill for Wanjiku? Both are a twin evil. The Finance Bill 2026 is taxing Kenyans into poverty. It is a killer and a threat to common mwananchi. It will break households while stifling the freedom of Kenyans and violating the very soul of our nation. The Constitution of Kenya 2010. It is a budget for a 50 regime billionaires and 1 trillionaire out of our sweat and blood. The two documents are not a rescue plan for the common mwananchi, but an increased tax burden on workers, consumers, farmers, businesses, manufacturers, SMEs, border operators, mama mbogas, and the youth who are the very soul of our nation. In my remarks, I will demonstrate how this is so. We, the Democracy for the Citizens Party, DCP, affirm that a national budget must be a plan for prosperity, a blueprint for opportunity, and a statement that gives priority to the people and not a cake for a few elites. We strongly hold that a people-centered budget must give priority to affordable food, access to education, affordable health care, affordable farm inputs, support small and medium enterprises, and support household savings and expand opportunities for our young people. Additionally, it must fully adhere to the Constitution of Kenya, and in particular Articles 220 and 221 on public participation. This budget does none of this. In fact, it does the exact opposite by violating the Constitution and in fact waging a terrifying economic war. The budget estimates before us at Kenya shillings 4.82 trillion is completely out of touch with Wanjiku. The projected revenue is about Kenya shillings 3.67 trillion, leaving a deficit of Kenya shillings 1.144 trillion. We have a clueless regime led by an elite cabal that continues to vomit on our feet and display their ill-gotten wealth. They are presenting to us, the people of Kenya, a budget with an intention to borrow Kenya shillings 3.13 billion per day. This, in simple terms, translates to an average borrowing spree of Kenya shillings 125 million per hour. This is the money You see roofing State House, traveling overseas in luxurious jets, being dished at State House to bribe voters, and in EUDA campaign lorries, while the balances are blown in helicopters, in needless flights and charters. What if this money was channeled to our schools, hospitals, and road infrastructure to achieve a multiplier effect in the economy? Reports have shown that this government steals Kenya shillings 3 billion per day. Ironically, the same government borrows 3.14 billion per day. Why borrow to steal? Why can't you even steal less if at all you have to? What a regime. But first, we pose a fundamental question and state an undeniable fact. Over the last 4 years, the Ruto regime has taxed and illegally levied hardworking Kenyans a whopping 8.7 trillion Kenya shillings. Further, they have borrowed a whole 4.2 trillion Kenya shillings. Please show us the corresponding development projects. Where is the impact on Wanjiko? Fellow Kenyans, further, our country is trapped in a dangerous borrowing cycle. The Grand Coalition government under the late President Mwai Kibaki, the greatest president of our time, borrowed Kenya shillings 1.3 trillion in 10 years. The Jubilee government under President Uhuru Kenyatta borrowed 6.7 trillion in 10 years. This regime, a one-man show, has borrowed 4.2 trillion in 3 years. Today, as we speak, our public debt stands at 13 trillion Kenya shillings. The debt to GDP ratio is at 72.4%, which is far beyond the legal ceiling set by the Public Finance Management Act 2023. Ordinarily, a ratio of 55% debt to the GDP should guide fiscal restraint. But more troubling is the fact that interest on debt is currently at 1.3 trillion Kenya shillings per year. This is 79% of our revenue. The interest on debt has become the largest consumer of public revenue. In practical terms, the government is working first for leaders, then for the people, and we, the people of Kenya, are on our own. Dear Kenyans, I have been on record several times on the crisis our nation is in. Out of the 4.2 trillion Kenya shillings borrowed recklessly by this regime, only Kenya shillings 1.9 trillion went to the development expenditure. This is in direct contravention of Article 211 Constitution of Kenya. It also contravenes Section 152C of the PMF Act that prohibits the government from borrowing for recurrent expenditures. What kind of a household borrows a loan from a bank to buy food? To make the matters worse, the budget statement to be read next week proposes to borrow an additional 1.114 trillion Kenya shillings. Out of this, only 700 billion Kenya shillings will be spent on development. Where is the Kenya shillings 400 billion? This is budgeted corruption. In the financial year 2024-25, the government targeted to raise 2.75 trillion Kenya shillings, but collected only 2.26 trillion Kenya shillings. The revenue target was missed by Kenya shillings 487 billion. Why? In the financial year 2025-2026, the target was raised to Kenya shillings 2.92 trillion. The collections are at only Kenya shillings 2.04 trillion, leaving a shortfall of Kenya shillings 877 billion. Despite this persistent underperformance, the government is projecting tax revenues of Kenya shillings 2.86 trillion in the financial year 2026-2027. We are well advised that a realistic projection on revenue collections will be at 2.29 trillion Kenya shillings. Kenyans should expect a worse tax regime midway and lots of failed promises as usual. As the DCP party, we note with great concern that the expenditure projections of this regime continue to grow at a pace completely out of touch with Wanjiku. For example, a teacher in Wajir who earned a gross pay of 50,000 Kenya shillings in the year 2022 took home a net pay of Kenya shillings 42,000. However, and unfortunately under this regime, the same teacher takes home a net pay of 38,000 Kenya shillings. This is to skyrocketing food and fuel prices, and to a country where the roads are poorer, schools are no longer get capitation, and health care no longer works. Another example, in the year 2022, a basket of essential goods stood at Kenya shillings 14,000. Under this elite regime, it is now stands at 25,000 Kenya shillings for a medium-sized family. In addition to a shrinking payslip, Kenyan households are no longer able to save or afford essential goods for their families. Above all, the purchasing power has been sunk. This is while the wages remain stagnant and taxes keep soaring. Fellow Kenyans, the result is not prosperity. The result is economic fatigue, reduced consumer spending, shrinking margins for businesses, and rising public anger. Kenyans remain under deep unspoken stress. In the budget statement, we have made a closer examination of sectoral allocations, reveals a worrying shift in Kenya's national priorities over the past 3 years. Kenya's priority sectors are education, health, and agriculture. These sectors touch every Kenyan and every facet of our lives. Previous informed and caring governments gave priority and adequate funding to these sectors. During the Grand Coalition administration, education continuously received between 20 and 25% of the national budget, making it one of the government's highest priorities. Under the Jubilee administration of President Uhuru Kenyatta, education remained a major priority, receiving between 24 to 27% of the national budget. Under Mr. William Ruto, education funding has fallen to 16.2% of the budget. This drop is felt directly by the parents who are being forced to pay for primary and secondary education, school, college, and university education. The gains made in free primary and free day secondary school education are all being blown into oblivion. What is the future of our children? Why is this regime at war with our children and our youth? Why are you killing our future? Under the budget estimates of 2025-2026 financial year, agriculture remains at crossroads. Traditionally, agriculture has been the backbone of our economy. The sector has been traditionally receiving between 4% to 6%. Under this regime, agriculture has been grossly defunded. Only 2% of the total budget has been allocated to this sector. This is despite the fact that this sector employs a majority of the population and remains the socio-economic backbone of our rural livelihoods. Mr. President, why are you defunding agriculture? Did you consult the over 7.1 million registered farmers and the 40% of the total population and nearly 70% of the rural workforce depending on agriculture? On matters health, the sector has historically received between 6 to 8% of the total budget. Unfortunately and painfully, under the current budget estimates, the sector has been allocated a paltry 3.5% of the total budget. This is despite the fact that Kenyans are paying more taxes and higher share deductions than ever before. What is more important to citizens of any nation if not healthcare? A healthy nation is a wealthy nation. In any case, a nation's greatest resource is its people. These people must be healthy and productive. Despite suffocating critical sectors, the government continues to increase allocations to non-essential expenditures. The presidency and State House have continued to expand up to 17 billion in this year's budget. This is funding opulence and corruption. What does State House need Kenya shilling 17 billion for? Are there schools and hospitals in State House? Fellow Kenyans, between the 2022 to 2026, allocation to the security docket steadily rose from Kenya shillings 318 billion to Kenya shillings 567 billion, an increase of Kenya shillings 249 billion without corresponding improvement in securing the people of Kenya and our territory. Why this sharp increase? Why do we still have jubilant forces still occupying Mandera County and harassing Kenyans? Why are goons working alongside the National Police Service? In recent months, the government has continued to channel billions in travel, hospitality, and administrative overheads, where ordinary Kenyans are being asked to sacrifice more. Official supplementary estimates show that Kenya shillings 8.4 billion was allocated to State House alone for hospitality, domestic travel, and vehicle operations, while the Controller of Budget flagged Kenya shillings 10.8 billion in travel spending in just 6 months. At the broader level, the current expenditure continues to dominate the budget. Approximately Kenya shillings 1.2 trillion has been allocated for operations and maintenance across government, while Kenya shillings 1.3 trillion is consumed by loan interest payments. As a result, development priorities continue to be squeezed. On the debt management, why is this regime in an open violation of Article 211 of the Constitution of Kenya 2010 and Section 15(2)(c) of the PMF Act 2012 that strictly prohibits the financing of recurrent expenditure using debt? We note that the Grand Coalition government borrowed an average of 200 billion annually. The Jubilee government borrowed an average of 700 billion annually. This regime borrows an average of Kenya shillings 1.4 trillion annually with no corresponding development or services. Dear Kenyans, let us now look at the Punitive Finance Bill 2026-2027. This is the worst finance bill in the history of Kenya. It does not deserve the light of the day. The bill is deeply detrimental. It increases heavy taxation pressure, doubles compliance pressure, and escalates household costs. We thought it would have been expanded the economy and cushioned the ordinary mwananchi. Our first concern is the continued pursuit of unrealistic revenue targets, despite a history of persistent underperformance and an underperforming economy. The government revenue collections have consistently fallen short of targets, yet the response has been to introduce new taxes and illegal levies rather than addressing inefficiencies, broadening the tax base, or stimulating economic growth. This creates a cycle where businesses and citizens are repeatedly asked to shoulder a heavier burden to compensate for unrealistic fiscal planning. The second concern is a proposal to move certain products from zero-rated to VAT exempt status, including solar products, electric mobility equipment, locally assembled mobile phones, and animal feeds. While this may appear neutral on paper, it effectively increases costs because producers can no longer recover input VAT. The inevitable result is higher prices for consumers, farmers, and businesses. At a time when Kenya should be encouraging renewable energy, agricultural productivity, and digital inclusion, these proposals move in the opposite direction. The proposed 16% VAT on digital payment service provider commissions is another regressive measure. Kenya has become a global leader in financial inclusion because mobile money and digital payments have reduced transaction costs and expanded access to financial services. There will be more pain at M-Pesa shops and ATM machines. Taxing these services will increase costs for traders, SMEs, schools, hospitals, and ordinary citizens who rely on mobile payments. And ultimately, these costs will be passed on to the consumers and could reverse years of progress in financial inclusion. Further, the proposal to increase excise duty on mobile phones from 10% to 25% is particularly damaging to young people and low-income households. Mobile phones are no longer luxury goods. They are essential tools for education, businesses, communication, financial services, content creation for youth and the Gen Zs, and job searching. Increasing their costs will widen the digital divide and disproportionately affect students, entrepreneurs, and rural communities. We certainly know the finance bill also proposes a 30% growth withholding tax for what is called non-resident landlords, but effectively it affects the Kenyans in diaspora. While intended to raise revenue, the practical effect is likely to be higher rents for businesses and commercial tenants as landlords pass this cost to occupiers. This will increase operating costs for businesses and contribute to higher consumer prices. This is unfairly targeting our diaspora communities who should be investing back home while they work abroad. Where do you want these Kenyans to retire to? Or where do you want them to invest? Equally concerning is a proposal introducing a 60% minimum deemed dividend threshold. This measure risks penalizing businesses that retain earnings for expansion, working capital, debt repayment, and an investment. Rather than encouraging growth and job creation, firms will be forced to distribute funds that would otherwise be used for investment. From a governance perspective, one of the most troubling provisions is the proposed removal of protections against agency notices during active tax appeals. This will allow tax authorities to freeze bank accounts and enforce collection actions while disputes are still before tribunals or courts. Such powers will cripple businesses before they have an opportunity to be heard, undermining due process, investor confidence, and the constitutional principle of fair administrative action. The finance bill further proposes tax filing timelines from June 30th to April 30th and introduces stricter objection deadlines, which include weekends and public holidays, increasing compliance costs for businesses and taxpayers. These measures may appear administrative, but they affect businesses that lack the resources of larger corporations and will struggle to comply within shortened timelines. The cumulative effect of these proposals is deeply worrying. At a time when Kenyans are already grappling with a high cost of living, rising statutory deductions, expensive credit, unemployment, and weak economic growth, the Finance Bill 2026 places additional pressure on households and businesses. Instead of stimulating production, encouraging investment, and creating jobs, many of the proposals risk making Kenya a more expensive place to live, work, invest, and do business. We strongly hold that a people-centered finance bill would focus on expanding the tax base, sealing revenue leakages, promoting investment, protecting taxpayers' rights, supporting farmers and businesses, and creating an environment where economic growth and naturally generates sustainable tax revenues. Unfortunately, the current bill leans too heavily toward extracting more from an already strained economy, while doing too little to address the structural weaknesses that continue to undermine growth and prosperity. The finance bill represents a continuation of a failed philosophy. Whenever revenue targets are set, the government responds by introducing new taxes, new levies, new compliance obligations, and new penalties instead of confronting waste, corruption, and inefficiency within government itself. The danger is clear. Kenya cannot tax its way to prosperity. As Winston Churchill argued, a nation trying to tax itself into prosperity is like a man standing in a bucket and trying to lift himself up by the handle. In light of the danger the people of Kenya are exposed to through these budget estimates and punitive finance bill, DCP would rather have done the following to cushion Kenyans, create a prosperous nation, and dignify the Kenyan people. 1, immediately we would stop the housing levy deductions to give relief to the payslip, return dignity to the employed, and extra expenses on employers. 2, We would propose that the government cuts wasteful and non-essential expenditure. State machinery must tighten its own belt before it demands sacrifice from the public. What is Kenya shillings 17 billion allocation to State House stand for? We would reduce it to Kenya shillings 3 billion. Thirdly, debt growth must be slowed, and then disciplined borrowing must be linked to high impact development, not recurrent consumption. Kenya must move toward a more sustainable fiscal posture with a credible plan to reduce the deficit over time. Fourthly, education, agriculture, and health must be protected as priority sectors. Agriculture should be funded as the engine of food security, rural employment, and lower inflation. Health should be funded as a core human right and an investment in productivity. 5, the government should pay pending bills to businesses and suppliers. That would restore liquidity, support SMEs, and stimulate activity across the economy. 6, taxation must be broadened fairly rather than imposed repeatedly on the same shrinking base. Compliance should be improved through modernization, transparency, and trust, not through punitive pressure on households already stretched to the limit. 7, Parliament must claim its oversight role. Budgets should be interrogated line by line, not passed as routine exercise. The legislature must insist on accountability, realistic revenue assumptions, and the protection of vulnerable sectors. Oversight is not obstruction, it is stewardship. Finally, the government must restore accountability. Every shilling spent should be explainable. Every project should be measurable. Every ministry should be held to performance, not rhetoric. In addition to the above, we would restructure the budget as follows. Reduce the entire budget from Kenya shillings 4.8 trillion to Kenya shillings 3.7 trillion. In agriculture, we would increase from 97 billion to 300 billion. Health increase from 167.4 billion to 450 billion. Public administration, we would reduce from 354.9 billion to 250 billion. And borrowing, we would reduce from 1.44 trillion to zero borrowing. As DCP, we demand as follows. First, we demand a significant increase in funding for agriculture and healthcare, as I've already explained. Agriculture currently receives only 2.0% of the national budget, despite employing the majority of Kenyans and driving food security. We call for a progressive increase to at least 6% of the budget, approximately 300 billion Kenya shillings, as an immediate step towards achieving the 10% Maputo Declaration target. These resources should be directed toward irrigation, extension services, fertilizer support, value addition, storage facilities, aggregation centers, and market access to farmers. Health currently receives only 3.5% of the budget, far below the 15% Abuja Declaration target. We demand an increase to at least 9.5% of the budget to strengthen the county hospitals, improve staffing, ensure medicine availability, and make healthcare affordable and accessible for all Kenyans. Secondly, we demand a reduction in administrative and recurrent expenditure. Public administration currently consumes approximately 354.9 billion, while State House and other administrative expenditures continue to grow. The government must lead by example by reducing non-essential travel, hospitality, consultancies, duplication of agencies, and other administrative overheads. We propose a minimum 30% reduction, that's about 150 billion, in non-essential administrative expenditure, with the savings redirected to agriculture, health, education, and job creation. Thirdly, we demand realistic and credible revenue targets. For 3 consecutive years, the government has allocated only 80% of its projected tax revenues. Yet it continues to budget on increasingly ambitious assumptions. The Treasury must align revenue projections with actual economic performance and stop using unrealistic targets to justify new taxes and levies. A credible budget is built on realistic numbers, not wishful thinking. Number 4, we demand a reduction in borrowing and a clear path to fiscal sustainability. The 2026-2027 budget proposes a deficit of approximately 1.144 trillion, financed entirely through new debt. Kenya's public debt has already reached Kenya shillings 13 trillion, while debt servicing consumes more than half of government revenues. We call for a balanced budget with zero provision for new debt. Fellow Kenyans, if our country is to recover, we need a national reset built on discipline, fairness, and productive investment. This means restoring confidence in public finance. It means using public money to unlock private activity rather than crowd it out. It means making agriculture profitable, healthcare accessible, education effective, and business financing affordable. It also means understanding that economic growth is not created by slogans. Growth comes from productivity. It comes from predictable policy. It comes from trust between the state and citizens. It comes from a government that spends with restraint and plans with honesty. We demand a budget that puts people before politics and production before consumption. Kenya's future depends not on how much the government spends, but on how wisely it spends it. The farmer, the young people, the teacher, the healthcare worker, the entrepreneur, the police, and the civil servants searching for opportunities must once again become the center of national economic policy. We call on all elected representatives of the people to listen to the people and reject in total this budget estimate and finance bill 2026-2027. Fellow Kenyans, this budget should have been an opportunity to reset our fiscal path. Instead, it risks deepening the same pattern of debt dependence, weak priorities, and citizen frustration. We reject the idea that the national development is achieved by taxing people more while protecting inefficiency. We reject the idea that debt is an alternative to discipline. We reject the idea that a government can build prosperity by ignoring its citizens. The future of Kenya will not be built by a budget that feeds bureaucracy. It will be built by a budget that empowers production, protects the vulnerable, rewards honesty, and places people before politics. That is the Kenya we deserve. That is the Kenya we must demand. And that is the Kenya that we must build. Finally, I urge the people of Kenya that we remain vigilant. We must call out our elected leaders supporting this reckless budget estimate and punitive Finance Bill 2026-27. Keep a record of all those who will stand with the Kenyan people and those who will stand with this reckless proposal and regime. The day of reckoning is 10th August 2027. God bless you, God bless Kenya, and thank you.